negative energy. This can explain dark energy. And there's also this idea that I believe it came from John Archibald Wheeler, that the quantum foam. And the quantum foam is that sea of energy that's out there. The way to think of it conceptually with respect to zero-point energy is imagine that space is not empty, but instead tiny bubbles that are there. And they're all touching each other all the time. And then we're moving through them like we are just fish in the fish tank out there. And once you look at it from that perspective, it becomes a lot more obvious. The second law of thermodynamics is a little bit more vague, but it's basically saying that no system can be perfectly efficient, no closed system, because you're always going to lose a little bit of energy due to heat, entropy. Well, in this type of situation, all we have to do is take Pac-Man's mouth and open up our system. The analogy that I love to use is that of a windmill. If you just put a windmill somewhere, like in this house, it's not going to do anything, right? That system itself isn't going to produce any energy. But if you open that system up to wind and you insert that wind into your system, now you can produce as much energy as you can with wind, as much wind that can be produced. This is the same concept as opening your system up to the ether, to the Dirac sea of energy that's out there. Now you have this capability. We have an unlimited reservoir of energy out there. Some people say it's like 10 to the 100 power, 100 zeros after 10 of energy that we can extract. So it's like taking a thimble and trying to empty the ocean full of the energy. It would never happen. And the moment you pull a little energy out of there, it kind of self equalizes right away. Like, you know, the water kind of collapses onto that location and fills that location back up right away. So we can get around both the first and second laws of thermodynamics just by doing that. And the other concept that I want to throw at you real quick, and I want to hear your thoughts, are where does energy even come from? Like, if the energy is coming from there, how does energy even really work? And I want to shout out Tom Bearden, who's one of the legends of engineers. He was lieutenant colonel, worked in black projects for decades. He put so much stuff on the internet, videos on the internet, because I think he knew like one day people are going to realize this stuff's true. And one of the big quotes he said is that all the coal and oil we've ever burned, all the wind and solar power that's out there has never added 1 watt to the electric lines, to the power lines, to the grid. And you're like, what is that? That's weird. What does that mean? And he says that all we need to have energy flow is a dipole. Imagine a battery or a capacitor. What is that? It's just an asymmetry. It means we have more negative charge on one side than on the other. And when you connect it to a circuit, it begins to flow and try to equalize. It's like trying to take the long route home. And once it all equalizes and becomes neutral, the energy stops. Our dipole closes. So he says the answer to this is keep your dipole open. As long as you have an asymmetry, a capacitor, a battery that has your more negative charge on one side than the other, energy is going to keep flowing out there. And he says what we've been doing wrong this whole time is we're destroying our dipole over and over again. We should think about the problem completely differently. What I tell people, and the analogy I give is like, if I push somebody on a swing, I don't constantly push on the swing back and forth, right? That would be silly. That's inefficient. I wait for the swing to come back, and then I push on the swing. And I push on the swing in a resonance, right? Every time it comes back. And you could, if you were to graph it on a timestamp, you could see push, 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 push. That's basically what he says that we need to do as well, is that we need to pulse a current potentially into our system. If we look at it differently, instead of pushing all the time and just push at a certain point, then potentially we can keep our dipole open much more efficiently than conventional power systems work right now. The last thing I'll say is that I don't think people even realize how power plants work, like a nuclear power plant. I think a lot of people have this idea of like, oh, we're splitting an atom and then the electricity comes out of the atom and we're extracting that. And that would seem efficient if that was the case. That's not what we do at all. We basically put some material into a water, it boils the water, the steam comes out of the water, and then it spins a turbine. And that turbine is basically a generator, or it's like I could just hand crank a generator. And that generator creates the asymmetry of the charges, creates our dipole there. And this is what I think Tesla figured out. I think he figured it out over 100 years ago. I think many other people have figured it out. I think a lot of these over unity free energy devices that people have discredited really do work.
Do you owe back taxes? Pandemic relief is now over. The IRS is hiring thousands /Candace. That's tnusa.com/Candace.
A lot of these people ended up dead or in prison too.
Yes.
Once you start looking into anything that would have moved humanity forward, they're all called quacks. They're imprisoned for fraud, which is a very strange thing to do in a free market, to imprison someone for fraud. And it gets very interesting very quick when you once you know what you're looking for and you realize that there has been some sort of a government conspiracy to keep information from us. In fact, one of the things that I say is when you really start getting into history, you realize that enlightenment they tell you about was actually the dawn of humanity being darkened. Like it's actually we are in the dark ages, I think, right now. And when somebody pops their head up and starts to look and says, hey, we could just be doing this,
and that's what's scary, because
it comes down on them. The whole system comes down on them.
absolutely. And who is the system? That's a big question I ask too, because I think it's more than just the government. I actually like the term deep state, but I don't think we should be thinking on it in terms of just the CIA. Certainly the CIA is part of it, I think, no doubt whatsoever. I think they know basically everything's out there, but the large corporations, right? I think that the two...
Well, I think they are the CIA. That's my point.
Oh,
I
yeah,
see all these stories of like, I was just in my garage and I made Google. And I'm like, I don't think that's exactly how it happened, actually. I don't think you
the CIA helped fund Google Earth, which is kind of interesting. The CIA also fund Palantir, which Peter Thiel is the head of. I mean, you look at this and you see that really what we're dealing with is very connected people that are very rich, that are connected. I mean, honestly, even Elon Musk, who refuses to comment about these videos, he's one of the biggest defense contractors for the US government through SpaceX. He actually just sent up more spy satellites. They're putting a new constellation up, actually, of satellites that are smaller and many more of them, because they're afraid that Russia and China are going to use electromagnetic-based weapons to wipe out our satellites, and then our constellation is screwed. So they're now like basically diversifying their risk by putting more out there, which is why I think these guys can't talk about a lot of the surveillance stuff, because he's got NDAs that like if those videos are real and that's a satellite video, his NDA says he can't speak about it, right? Which makes me, look, I understand it from these kind of perspective, from Elon Musk's perspective, the Lou Elizondos, these other UFO people, is that free energy is dangerous, because if you do have this capability to just pull energy straight out of the ether that's out there, you can just accumulate that energy. Or what if we can amplify how much we pull out of there? Maybe plasma, like a plasma orb, can basically just use the same resonance. Like if I was in my bathtub and I'm taking a bath and I start rocking back and forth, at a resonance, eventually the water is going to start shooting over the side of the tub, right? It starts to amplify more and more and more and more and more through like standing waves, potentially. So if you can do that with energy as well, potentially using that same Casimir effect, but we don't need to use two plates. We can engineer it a little bit differently. What if there's other ways where we can find an asymmetry? And if we can do that, it becomes dangerous. This is where I spoke to Salvatore Paez. Big shout out to him. Everybody should take a look at his patents, because he's got high frequency gravitational wave generator. He's got inertial mass reduction for a transmedium craft as one of his patents. He's also got plasma confinement based on magnets as well. And there are like a bunch of experiments that you can see on the internet, but the guy who should really get a lot of shout out is a guy named Ken Shoulders. Ken Shoulders, actually Richard Feynman was the person who said that there's enough energy like in this cup, just in the area of this cup, in the 0 point energy, to vaporize all the Earth's oceans. So he was one of those people who was saying, there's not nothing here, there's this huge amount. Ken Shoulders was researching plasmas. He called them exotic vacuum objects because he believed that they were extracting energy from the vacuum. And Richard Feynman initially thought he was kind of kooky, that he didn't have it figured out. He ended up having to apologize to him, because he was like, no, you're right, we can do this. Well, Hal Puthoff wrote a paper with Cole where they showed that Casimir effect does not violate laws of thermodynamics. And one thing he said there is a better mechanism for the Casimir effect might be a highly charged plasma. Now, when you look into Ken Shoulders' work of exotic vacuum objects, you find out that one of the things that happens in these plasmas, which is the fourth state of matter, is the electrons start to break free. Not only do they break free, but they start to act weird. Normally, like I said before, the electrons will basically repel one another because they have the same charge. So they will potentially, the closer you get, the more they're going to repel one another. But when they start to break free and in superconductivity, they form Cooper pairs, we call them, which is basically the electrons start to group up when they really shouldn't. Now, why is this important? Because remember what I just said about the dipole and the capacitor. If you have this asymmetry where your electrons are grouped up, and now you have this asymmetry where there's more down here than there is up here, you're going to get energy flowing. So Ken Shoulders found out and proposed that you could have basically a self-sustaining ball of plasma that is constantly pulling energy directly out of the ether. And the dynamic Casimir effect, along with the Schwinger effect and the Schwinger limit, would propose that when we do this, when we pull these photons out of the ether, it may create a magnetic monopole. Now, a magnetic monopole, if you look at a magnet, it's going to have these magnetic field lines that go from north to south. A magnetic monopole is just a north or just a south, meaning it's just pulling inward or just pushing outward. And this can be used to very accurately control a magnetic field. So now when we look at that thermal video of the orbs that we were looking at MH370, based on what I've said to you right now, it's like, well, wow, we can almost explain everything that we're seeing here now. We can say that this is a field of plasma, this ball. It's a non-radiating barrier, the edge of it, is basically where the magnetic field stops, so to speak. You can even see a heat signature that's shaped like the Tesla sign in there, which could be like a vortex, which is where, think of it like your drain when you pull the water out of your tub and you see the drain. Same concept, but between what we perceive all around us and this ether that's going on there. And then with respect to these dark lines we see in front of the orbs, that's basically just negative energy. They're basically shielding the 0-point energy in front of the orb, which allows it to just float freely. Similar to if I was on one of those conveyor belt things, right? It's not that me that's moving, it's space itself that's moving. So they're essentially an Alcubierre warp drive, I would argue. And warp drive doesn't have to be superluminal speeds beyond the speed of light. It can also be any speed that you technically want it to go. And then what's happening when the plane disappears? Well, now these same orbs converge on the plane. And now that we've shown that there's this 0-point energy connection to gravity, we can see that what if we look at the Coulomb's law, which is an electric force law. If you imagine those orbs are magnets and they have each has the same charge. If I were to jam two magnets together, I'm going to feel a strong repulsive force. Potentially that's what the orbs are doing when they're converging, because they're in a perfect equilateral triangle. So at the midpoint there, you're going to have your 0 point, as they call it, where everything's going to converge directly on the plane. So that would be the exact center of the singularity that you're forming. And potentially they're producing a magnetic flux that's so powerful by jamming them together at a certain speed that it breaks space-time, so to speak, just makes a ripple, so to speak, as you were saying in terms of surfing. And now that plane moves faster than the speed of light. And it doesn't move faster than the speed of light itself, but from outside perspective looking at it, it's looking like it's moving faster than the speed of light. It just disappears here and then shows up over here somewhere else. And it's not the plane that's moving, but the medium that's moving from one location to the other. And it looks weird to us because we don't perceive that extra dimension that's already out there.
Interesting. So then if they're able to do this, which I think they are, and they sort of use this technology to move the
Yep.
plane, what do you think happened to the passengers? What do you
Yeah.
think happened to the cargo? And what do you think happened as well? Do you think that's the reason, rather, that the debris was
Yeah.
found where it was?
Yeah, so I would argue it could even be the fire, or it could be the event that caused some structural integrity to the plane, for sure. I think that if you use the right-hand rule in electrical engineering, which takes your electric and your magnetic fields, and you create something called the Poynting vector, which would determine the flow of power, the vector of your wave, you can see these orbs actually change their orientation. They're in this triangle formation spinning around the plane, but then they go vertical, completely vertical. And you're like, huh, that's interesting. And they start spinning. If you were looking directly at the plane, they would be going clockwise. And if you use that as your magnetic vector and your curl of my hands here, you'll find that the Poynting vector would be backwards. Now, this is really interesting because If you take the frame right before, as these orbs are converging, and the frame as this dark, cold endothermic event happens, which is potentially consistent with a negative energy type event happening, it looks like the plane goes backwards a little bit. You can kind of see the tail sticking out of this endothermic event that begins to form. And if it's going backwards, we've mapped the direction of travel of the plane based on the satellite coordinates going east. So that would mean it must be going somewhere to the west. Well, this is interesting because that fire suppression bottle was found in the Maldives over to the west. There was actually 20 more witnesses, 15 to 20 more witnesses on a small island in the Maldives in the early morning hours that saw the plane. And they were also all discredited because they said, well, there's no way. They saw the plane coming from the west. And people thought, well, even if this was the plane, it had to be coming from the east because that's where Nicobar Islands is, or in the South Indian Ocean. But if this plane is just snapping from one location to the other, now they might have actually seen the plane. These are people on a small island of like 3,000 people. They don't see jumbo jets flying low over their thing. They even saw the red and white stripe of Malaysian Airlines.
Wow.
Sergio Coloduvo, I think his name is, went out there and interviewed them. I watched the interviews. These guys they're not lying. They're not making up this story.
For what
And
reason?
where did they see the plane go? South, towards Diego Garcia military base.
Fascinating.
The argument, this is the base that all the conspiracy theories basically said this plane got remote controlled there or what have you. Marc Dugain, who's a famous French author, actually was told to stop looking into the plane, and he had speculated the plane ended up there as well, like months after this thing disappeared. Catherine T, that witness that we said, I think it was in her 2018 blog, said that she thought the plane ended up at Diego Garcia. It's the only place to hide a plane. And then when you look at that debris drift analysis again, you realize a much better location for that debris to have gotten in the water is Diego Garcia. It actually fits with the currents, and it would make sense in terms of when that debris showed up in Africa as well. And I look at that and I go, we actually looked at the debris analysis that they did, and like at least 5 different pieces say it looked like the pieces were pulled apart. And I'm going, that doesn't sound like structural integrity. It sounds like they just disassembled the plane and threw a couple pieces in the ocean, right? And nobody questions, like, why does this debris show up in Africa? CNN, man, first of all, Don Lemon, shout out to Don Lemon. He might have been the most accurate. It's not technically a black hole, but wormhole is pretty close to a black hole. The only difference is there's no event horizon, which means that for the people that went through it, it would look like you're just walking through a doorway. Yeah. Like you instantly appear on the other side. But from the observer's perspective, there might even be a time dilation effect where they show up like a few minutes later, a few seconds later, a few hours later. It's really hard to tell. But CNN also ran this other piece where like they angrily mentioned like there's this conspiracy theory out there that the plane went to Diego Garcia. There's no merit to it whatsoever, but they don't actually address any of the arguments either.
What if it was hijacking or terrorism or mechanical failure or pilot error? But what if it was something fully that we don't really understand? A lot of people have been asking about that, about black holes and on and on and on and all of these conspiracy theories. Let's look at this. Noah says, what else can you think about? Black hole, Bermuda Triangle. And then Deji says, just like the movie Lost. And of course, they're also referencing the Twilight Zone, which has a very similar plot. That's what people are saying. I know it's preposterous, but is it preposterous, you think, Mary?
Well, it is. A black hole is about, a small black hole would suck in our entire universe, so we know it's not that. Bermuda Triangle is often weather, and Lost is a TV show. So
Right.
I think I always like things for which there's data, history, crunch the numbers. So for me, those aren't there, but I think it's wonderful that the whole world is trying to help with their theories, and I absolutely love the theories.
I always say,
classic, right?
yeah, we always know you're onto it because they're angry about something that shouldn't make them angry.
Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
authoritarian, it's not rational, and it's just, you're really stupid if you think this. And that should be a starting point. Look, we have covered so much here. This is absolutely fascinating. And I want to encourage everybody that's watching this to follow you. Where can they follow you and continue to look into this story if they want to know more?
Yeah, so the best place to follow me is on Twitter, on X. I feel like if I was anywhere else, I would have probably already been banned and wiped out. I'm actually surprised my YouTube channel hasn't been deleted, but that's mostly because I think I focus on the science now at this point. So you guys can watch my live streams Monday, Wednesday, Friday, talk about the plane, talk about secret science that's being held from us, talk about free energy on Fridays as well. And then on X, it's at JustXAshton, also at JustXAshton on YouTube as well. I am going to start posting clips from a lot of the appearances I've done. I've done like over 100 podcast appearances on TikTok and Instagram. Not that I love it, but if you want to interact with me, you come onto Twitter for sure. Yeah.
Ashton, thank you so much for joining us. This has honestly been one of my favorite conversations that I've ever had.
Thank you, Candace. I appreciate it. You're awesome.